Ambiguous terms, that is, words which can mean more than one thing, cause a lot of confusion. For instance, suppose you say, "I am so hot." Do you mean that you're hot and sweaty? Or do you mean that you're angry? Or do you mean that you're very attractive? Your statement is ambiguous. Now in this case, it's pretty easy to get rid of the ambiguity. There are ambiguities which pervade scholarly and popular discourse which are not as easy to get rid of. That's what this talk is about. There is some standard terminology when it comes to talking about religion. A theist is someone who believes that God exists, and an atheist is someone who thinks it is not the case that God exists. They think that it is false that God exists. Now, in recent public discourse, some atheists have tried to change the definition of the word atheism so that it means not someone who believes there is no God, but rather just someone who lacks belief in God. Frankly, this is a marketing decision. It makes atheism sound like a more defensible and modest position. The redefinition is both unnecessary and confusing. For a long time we've had a standard term which means the view in question, and that term is agnostic. An agnostic is someone who doesn't believe that God exists, and they don't believe that there is no God either. So when it comes to the claim that God exists, the theist affirms it, the atheist denies it, and the agnostic neither affirms nor denies it. Now at this point you might be asking yourself, sure, but what do you mean by the word God? Some people will say, I don't believe in a personal God. That's a fact about how people use this term, and it shows that this term God is ambiguous. We need to improve our terminology. The ambiguity of the term God makes all three of these terms, theist, atheist, and agnostic, ambiguous terms. You're affirming the existence of what exactly? Denying the existence of what? Or what kind of entity is it about which you are uncommitted? But it gets worse. We also have the concept of a polytheist, which is somebody who believes in more than one God. How does this relate to theism? Theism was described as belief in God. Is the polytheist a theist who just is more generous and believes in more gods? Or does polytheism contradict theism? Furthermore, if you're an atheist, is it enough if you just don't believe in God, but you might believe in the gods? Or to be an atheist, you have to disbelieve in any sort of God whatever. And notice that people write the word God in different ways. Sometimes they spell it with a capital G, and sometimes it's all lowercase letters. What's the difference? The standard terminology is ambiguous, it's confused, and it's confusing. And these confusions infect common discourse about religion, and they also infect scholarly discourse about religion. I don't have time to tell you the story, but interestingly enough, it was philosophers who created this problem around the end of the 1600s. But no problemo, I am a philosopher, and philosophers love to make distinctions. So in the rest of this presentation, I am going to supply you with some unambiguous terminology. Our problem is going to be cleared up by what philosophers call conceptual analysis. This involves defining not words, but concepts, and clarifying the logical relationships between concepts. But before we get that far, we need to note that sometimes when people use the word God, they're using it pretty much like a proper name. Generally, when they're doing this, they capitalize just the first letter, in the way that you capitalize the first letter of Mike or Sally. A proper name is what philosophers call a singular referring term, and the main point of it is just to refer to a particular individual. In contrast, sometimes people use the term God for a kind of thing. So not just for an individual, but for a class of things, which may have 0 members, or it may have 1 member, or it may have many members. In this sense, the term God is used like the term dog, or rock, or planet. Again, not as a proper name, but as a term for a whole class or kind of things, which may or may not exist. We can't really do conceptual analysis on a proper name, so I'm going to now separate apart 2 different concepts of a God. And I've introduced the term God in all caps for one of those concepts, and I'm using the term God in all lowercase letters for the other concept. Let's start with the lowercase God. This term, as I'm using it, expresses a universal concept that all human beings have in all cultures, and they use many different words to express this same concept that we're about to define. A problem here is that people associate a lot of things with the word God. Now remember, we're not defining a word, we're analyzing a concept. What we're asking is, how would a thing have to be for that concept to apply to it? And we have to set aside associations we have with the word. For instance, with the word God, you may associate some of these features. But for most of them, something could satisfy the concept of a God and not have that feature. Again, you may associate certain images with God, such as the image of an old man in the sky, or the image of a certain Hindu idol, and you probably have emotional associations with the term God. Maybe it sounds like a positive term to you, or maybe it recalls the bitterness of many hours wasted in Sunday school. But you have to leave all that aside. What we're asking is, what would a thing have to be for the concept God to apply to that thing? Here's my best attempt at an analysis. First of all, a God is supposed to be a self. A self is something with a first-person point of view, which has knowledge and the ability to intentionally choose. A self is in principle something that you could talk to or hear from or have a friendship with. We're not talking about the concept of a human being specifically. Yes, adult humans are usually selves, but if there were really intelligent aliens, they too would be selves. If there are angels, they would be selves. Of course, a God is not supposed to be just any old self. A God is supposed to be much more powerful than any ordinary human being. I'm not a god, and you're not a god. The smartest physicist isn't a god. The biggest bodybuilder, isn't a god. A god is supposed to be able to do things like instantaneously appear and disappear, or heal the sick, or fly through the air, or cause the dead to come back to life, that sort of thing. Which shows you that there's a third element. It's not just a degree of power, but a god is supposed to have supernatural power. If we augmented the powers of an ordinary human being, so that the person was clairvoyant or could bend spoons with their mind, that would be an unusual human being, but it wouldn't necessarily be a god. This person with special powers wouldn't be much more powerful than an ordinary human being, and we might suppose that their power isn't supernatural, but really they're somehow manipulating some unseen force of nature. A god is supposed to be able to do things despite how the world normally works. To sum it all up then, a god is supposed to be a self which is much more powerful than any ordinary human being and which has supernatural power. Despite the three components of the concept then, it's actually a very simple concept, and it's a concept which people can form at a young age and in any culture. And it's not quite the same as the concept of a superhero. Superman and Wonder Woman don't have supernatural powers. And a god in this sense could be male or female or neither male nor female, and a god could be a human or not a human. There have been many cultures, for instance, who have believed that humans can become gods. The way that they become gods is to increase their power so that it's much greater than the power of a normal human, and so that it's supernatural. It's not just the concept of a spirit. A spirit needn't be very powerful. It might just be a little pest of a natural force, but a spirit nonetheless. And the flying spaghetti monster probably wouldn't be a god, according to this concept. It's just supposed to be like a powerful alien, but not have supernatural power. But maybe it depends on your noodleology. Anyhow, this is the sort of thing that Vishnu and Shiva and Jesus and Zeus and Quetzalcoatl and Diana and Hera and Isis and so on are supposed to be. A god is supposed to be a very powerful and supernaturally powerful self. Interestingly, if you read contemporary analytic philosophy of religion, you will find that when they talk about God, they are not using the concept I just elucidated for you. What they mean by God, I'm going to write using all caps. I'm not just talking about Christian philosophers. You see the same concept used in Judaic and Islamic philosophy, and you see the same concept used in many discussions by atheistic philosophers, philosophers who don't believe in God. You also see this concept in Hindu philosophy and religion. Some worshippers of Shiva or Vishnu or the goddess consider their god to be a perfect self. Remember then, a self is an entity, a being, which has a first-person point of view, that is to say, it's conscious, and which has knowledge and the ability to intentionally act, and which might communicate with a person or receive a person's communications, and with whom one might even have a sort of friendship. But it's a perfect self. Whatever the perfections are, it has to have the greatest mutually consistent set of perfections that anything could possibly have. Perfection is normally understood as including unlimited goodness, unlimited knowledge, and maximal power, and also being such as to not depend for one's existence on anything else. How does this relate then to the concept we looked at before, this much less specific concept of God? The implications are that if something is a God in this sense, then it also must be a God in the previous sense. The reverse of that, though, is false. It's incorrect to think that if something is a God in the common sense, then it must be a God in this specialized philosophical sense. It was philosophers who first articulated this concept of God. It goes back to at least Plato, but it's been used ever since then by all kinds of religious and non-religious philosophers. You could say, roughly speaking, that this is a monotheistic conception of a God. However, as we'll see in a minute, monotheistic religions typically employ both concepts. The one I refer to using all lowercase letters and the one I refer to using all uppercase letters. Another implication is that this sort of God is supposed to be ultimate, or an ultimate being. By an ultimate being, I mean a being which is unique and which is unsurpassable in reality and/or unsurpassable in explanatory priority. Roughly speaking, an ultimate being is the highest being. By definition, there couldn't be two ultimate beings, and this being is thought of as having the greatest kind of reality or the highest degree of reality and/or having explanatory priority. So if you trace back all explanations, eventually you come to this thing. A monotheistic God is supposed to be an ultimate, and a perfect self is going to be an ultimate. But you might be looking at this description and saying to yourself, why would that thing have to be a God in either sense? Well, that's right. Some people believe in ultimates which are not gods. The Tao of Daoism is supposed to be an ultimate, but is not supposed to be a god. Brahman of Advaita Vedanta Hindu philosophy is supposed to be an ultimate, but is not supposed to be a god. Here are the three concepts then that we've defined. First, there's the concept of a God, which we analyzed as having three components. We've got that here in red. Then we've just seen there's the concept of something which is ultimate, in the sense just explained in the previous slide. So here's my suggested terminology. Use the lowercase God to mean just a very powerful and supernaturally powerful self. The concept of God in the sense of a perfect being, which I've expressed as the term God in all caps, that is supposed to be something which is a God and which is also ultimate. When it comes then to an ultimate which is not a God, I suggest that the best generic term should just be ultimate with a capital U. I don't mean this to be contentious. I know a lot of people who believe in an ultimate which is not a self would like to still talk about God. They like to use that type of terminology. It's familiar terminology. But I suggest that it's confusing, and that it's doomed to be confusing, because everybody does have this concept of a small g God. And God, as popularly believed in many religions, is also a small g God, even when he's also conceived of as a God in all caps, as a perfect self. So it'll be a lot less confusing if we refer to things like the Tao or Brahman in Advaita Vedanta philosophy as ultimates rather than gods. Here then are the suggested terms. A God is a very supernaturally powerful self. In principle, there could be none of those, there could be one of them, or there could be a whole bunch of them. There's a different concept of God, God written in all caps. This is supposed to be a personal, perfect ultimate. That is to say, a perfect God. In principle, there could be only one of those, or none of them. An ultimate is defined as unique. There can't be two ultimates. And finally, we have the concept of an ultimate which is not a self, an impersonal ultimate. Again, there could be zero or one of those. And if there is an ultimate, there is no God in all caps. There might be any number of gods, lowercase. If there is a God, all caps, then there is no ultimate as defined here. If there is a God in the sense of a perfect being, then it is just false that the ultimate is impersonal. Are these concepts vague? Yes, I think all of them are vague, but they're vague in the right sort of way. The power of this scheme is its ability to distinguish different sorts of views clearly. Here's a chart in which we can represent the different possibilities. In the left-hand column, we have three possibilities: that the number of gods is 0, that the number of gods is 1, or that the number of gods is more than 1. And of course here we're talking just about the mighty selves, gods in the lowercase. But when you've specified how many of those gods you believe in, 0, 1, or more than one, it's still an open question about those other two sorts of beings. So if you look at the top row, the first possibility is that there is neither a perfect being nor an ultimate. On the other hand, there could be an ultimate, again defined as an impersonal ultimate reality, or there could be a personal ultimate reality, that is to say, a God in all caps. I haven't included as possibilities that there could be several ultimates, because that is supposed to be by definition incoherent, nor could there be several gods in the all caps sense. And because I'm not considering self-contradictory positions, I'm going to black out this upper right square. If there is a perfect self, then the number of lowercase gods cannot be 0, because everything which is an uppercase god is by definition also a lowercase god. It turns out then that we have 8 seemingly coherent positions. I'm going to give names to all of those positions in a moment, but before we do that, one beautiful thing about this chart is that it can illustrate exactly how ambiguous the common terminology is. If I ask you then, what do you believe in? You're probably going to say one of the following. You might say, I believe in the divine. This is a very mushy statement. It could mean any of the 7 positions marked in purple here. The only one that you're ruling out is the one I've left white. If you say, I believe in God, well, that can be just as ambiguous. Even if you say, I'm a monotheist, you've only gotten a little bit more specific. The mono part is clear. You believe in one God in some sense, but some people who call themselves monotheists are believers in an ultimate. And then it's still an open question how many small g gods they believe in. Again, someone might worship only one God and believe in only one God, and yet that God is not a perfect being, but only a mighty self. That's the position on the left here. Or you might be a believer in a perfect being who allows that in a different sense there are many gods. The term monotheism then inherits the ambiguity of the term God. The mono part is perfectly clear, but the theism part is equivocal. I think this term is redeemable though, as I'll explain shortly. You might say, I believe in the gods. Presumably you have some traditional pantheon in mind, but you've still left it an open question whether or not you also believe in an ultimate or in a perfect being. A sophisticated sort of person might say, I believe in an ultimate. Okay, but do you believe in a personal ultimate or in an impersonal ultimate? And also, you've left open the question about how many gods you believe in. If you're an atheist, don't be smug and think that it's only the religious people who have a hard time clearly stating their position. The term atheism is ambiguous. It leaves open these 6 different positions. It's clear that the atheist does not want to believe in a perfect being, the sort of being the Creator is usually held to be. But you will find atheists who evidently believe in lots and lots of gods, for instance, most Asian Buddhists. Yet Buddhist leaders regularly describe Buddhism as an atheistic religion. In America and Europe, when a person says, I'm an atheist, most likely they mean that upper left box there. They don't believe there are any gods in any sense. That view is implied by what philosophers call naturalism, and it's currently the ascendant worldview in the educated world. We need, though, a slightly more specific term for it. Finally, even if you say, I'm an agnostic, still your statement is ambiguous. Do you mean that you're holding open the possibility of the 3 positions I have marked in orange here? Or are you also open-minded about the other ones? It's simply unclear. Our common terminology then looks like it's riddled with ambiguity. What's the solution? The solution is to use more specific terms, which reflect the distinctions between these 3 concepts. Here are my suggestions. Let's start in the upper left. I suggest we call that person a naturalistic atheist. Naturalism is the view that what there is what a perfect science would describe. Or, more roughly, naturalism is the view that the natural world is all there is. That person doesn't believe in a perfect self, nor do they believe in any other sort of ultimate reality, nor do they believe in any gods. Moving to the right, I suggest we call this person an atheistic ultimist. This is somebody who believes in an ultimate with a capital U, but they're atheistic in that they don't believe in a perfect being. Now let's look at the lower left. This is a person who doesn't believe in any perfect being or in an ultimate, but they believe in many gods. The obvious term for this person is a polytheist. But what kind of polytheist? I suggest we call this person a polytheistic atheist. They're an atheist in that they don't believe in a perfect self, and yet they're polytheistic in that they believe in many gods. You might reasonably ask here, why atheism should mean the denial of a perfect self rather than the denial of any sort of God, my answer is this is how the term was introduced by philosophers back in the 1600s. The term was coined in this way, and that's a perfectly good usage. So those Asian Buddhists that I mentioned before would be in this category. They would be polytheistic atheists. At least some of them, that is. Now move one to the right. A person might believe in many gods and yet believe in an ultimate. I suggest we call this person a polytheistic ultimist. If you're a Buddhist and you believe in an ineffable Buddha nature as the ultimate reality, and yet you also believe in a pantheon of Buddhas or bodhisattvas or both, then you're in this category. That's what kind of polytheist you are. That's what kind of atheist you are. You're an ultimist. Finally, in the lower right, we have a polytheistic monotheist. This is somebody who believes in a perfect self, so they can't believe also in an impersonal ultimate, and yet they admit that the number of gods is more than one. This doesn't contradict their monotheism because the sense in which the gods are many is different from the sense in which there is only one God. There are many mighty selves, but there's only one perfect self. Who fits in that category? Well, probably most of the people who scholars call monotheists, be they Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, and so on. The more difficult to name positions are in the middle. These three middle positions are harder to name, and I think the reason for that is because these have been very unpopular views in the history of the world. Let's start on the right. I call this austere monotheism. This is where you believe in a perfect self, and yet that perfect self is the only God there is. It's the only mighty self. So you don't also believe in other supernatural powerful selves. You might say, well, wait a second, isn't this what Muslims and Jews and Christians believe in? Generally speaking, it's not, because people in those religions believe in angels. And angels are gods, as here defined. The only actual people I can think of who would be austere monotheists would be early modern people in England and in Europe who were called Deists. At least some of these people didn't believe in any sort of spirits or angels or gods in a lowercase sense, and yet they believed in a creator who is presumably a perfect being. Looking at the middle of the chart now, I call this atheistic theistic ultimism. It's atheistic in that it denies any perfect self. It's ultimism in that it affirms an ultimate reality. And for lack of a better term, I call it theistic because it says that the number of gods is one. This is a very strange view. If there are gods in the lowercase sense, it's hard to see why there would only be one of them. But perhaps somebody has held this view. Moving to the left, we have theistic atheism. This is a person who doesn't believe in a perfect being, but who does believe in one God. Perhaps some people in traditional religions hold this sort of view. They do believe in and worship a mighty self, and they assume it's the only mighty self, because who believes all that angel and demon stuff anymore? But maybe their girlfriend broke up with them, or their cat got crushed by the garage door, or something else terrible happened, and they came to the view that this mighty self is not perfect after all. Maybe they're bitter against God, so what they're calling God is not a perfect being, even if it's the creator. I can't think of anything better to call these people than theistic atheists. Well, that's it then. We've done what we set out to do. We came up with some terms which are not ambiguous, as the common terms are. We've charted out different, seemingly coherent possibilities. Admittedly, the three in the middle are strange, and it's the two at the top and the three at the bottom that are really the contenders for people's allegiance.